Welcome to today's deep dive. And let me tell you, we are diving deep into the world of family businesses in Latin America and the Caribbean. And, well, getting into all the feels while we're at it,
It's not your typical business analysis, that's for sure. Not even close.
because we're going way beyond the numbers, the spreadsheets. We're talking about socio-emotional wealth, or as the cool kids say, CW. And I'll admit, when I first heard SCW, I pictured, I don't know, maybe like Etsy shops, handmade crafts, that kind of thing.
Yeah, not quite the image that comes to mind when we're talking about, powerful family businesses.
Right. But as I dug into your research, I realized this SCW thing, it's serious business, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean where family ties run deep. And those emotions, well, they can make or break a deal.
They're intertwined, business and family. You can't separate them, even if you tried.
So for our listeners who are new to SCW, let's break it down. We're talking about the intangible stuff, the things you can't put a price tag on, the legacy, the family control, the emotional ties, the reputation, all those things that go way beyond just making a profit.
Imagine, if you will, a business that's been passed down for generations. It's not just about, making money. It's about upholding a legacy, a name. It's that feeling of pride, knowing you're carrying a torch, a tradition.
It's like the business itself becomes an extension of the family's identity. They're inseparable.
Exactly. And this is where the fiber model comes in. You familiar with that one?
Oh, absolutely. Family influence, identification, binding social ties, emotional attachment, and renewal through succession.
Fiber catchy, right. And seriously insightful when you're trying to understand how this whole SEW thing plays out.
And let me tell you, in Latin America and the Caribbean, each one of those fiber strands, it's amplified. We're talking next level.
Okay, so let's start with family influence, because we're not just talking about a CEO making decisions in a vacuum here, are we? Not even close. We're talking about a whole network of aunts, uncles, cousins, compadres even. Everyone's got a say. Everyone's got skin in the game. And not just financially, but emotionally, too.
So it's about maintaining that family grip on the business, even if sometimes, maybe, those decisions don't exactly line up with what the spreadsheets are telling them.
Sometimes you got to follow your heart, not just the numbers. I remember working with a family business, a coffee farm in Colombia. I've been in the family for over a century. Beautiful place. Anyway, when the patriarch passed away, his 5 children, they inherited the business. Now, financially, it made sense to sell a portion of the land. I mean, it would have solved a lot of problems, brought in a ton of cash, But selling, that was a non-starter.
Because it wasn't about the money at that point. It was about something bigger.
Exactly. It was an emotional decision driven by their SCW. And that's where identification comes in. That deep, personal connection to the business. It's more than ownership. It's part of their identity.
It's like their name isn't just on the building. It's practically woven into the fabric of their being.
You got it. And their reputation, their standing in the community, it's all connected to the business. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, reputation is gold.
Speaking of reputation, the research also talks about this interesting paradox. Because on one hand, a family name, it can open doors. It's a sign of trust, especially in a region where things can be a bit, well, unpredictable, let's say.
Trust is everything. It's the foundation.
But then on the other hand, some families, particularly those who have, shall we say, accumulated a bit of wealth, they're incredibly wary of standing out too much.
Oh, yeah. Kidnapping, extortion, those are real concerns, unfortunately. You have to find that balance. Leveraging your name to do business, but also, not becoming a target. It's a tightrope walk.
Trying to be both invisible and indispensable at the same time. That's a tough act to balance. And then, of course, we have binding social ties, which in this context, we're talking about something a bit more, shall we say, hardwired into the DNA of these businesses than just casual Friday drinks with the staff.
Oh, absolutely. These are bonds forged over generations sometimes, deep loyalty. You're not just doing business, you're practically family.
It's that it takes a village mentality, but on a whole other level.
Precisely. And these ties, they aren't just social, they're strategic. These businesses, they face challenges, volatility, but they know they can rely on those connections, those relationships when times get tough. And that makes all the difference. It's a safety net, but woven from trust and loyalty, years of shared experience. That's powerful stuff.
No doubt about it. And speaking of things you can't just, conjure up overnight, that brings us to emotional attachment. Which, well, in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean, cultures where relationships are everything, well, this is where things get really interesting.
Oh, it's fascinating. Those cultural values, they're embedded in how business gets done. In many of these family businesses, decisions aren't made just in a boardroom, you know? They're made at the dinner table, family gatherings, even weddings,
It's
funerals.
like the business itself is a reflection of those shared experiences. The good times, the tough times, the bonds that hold families together, it's all woven in.
Exactly. And while that creates this incredible resilience, it also adds, a layer of complexity. Outsiders, they don't always get it because you can't just crunch the numbers. You have to understand the emotional landscape, the unwritten rules.
Can you give us an example of how this emotional attachment,
Yeah.
how it actually plays out, like a real-world business scenario?
Sure, sure. I remember I was working with this textile company in Guatemala, family owned. They were facing some really stiff competition, cheaper imports, you know the story. And logically, they needed to streamline, become more efficient, maybe even, lay off some employees just to stay afloat. Tough decisions.
These weren't just employees, right? This was about more than just, bottom lines.
Right. There were seamstresses there. Their mothers had worked for the family. Grandmothers had taught the current CEO how to sew back in the day.
Wow. So it wasn't just about cutting costs. It was about potentially breaking those familial bonds.
Mhm.
And that's a whole other calculation.
Exactly. And in the end, they couldn't do it. They chose to invest in new machinery, even though it meant taking on more debt. They wanted to keep those relationships intact. Risky move.
But it sounds like it paid off.
It did. Their employees, they were loyal and they weathered the storm. Became even more successful, actually.
It's a really powerful example of how SEW, those deeply ingrained values, they can lead you to unexpected places, sometimes even greater success. But I imagine this emotional aspect can backfire too, right,
Oh,
Nick?
for sure, for sure. Double-edged sword, this whole thing. Because when you've got personal feelings, family drama, clashing personalities, and it's all wrapped up in the business, well, that's a recipe for, potential disaster.
It's like they say, don't mix business with pleasure. But in this case, it's don't mix business with family, which is, well, unavoidable for these businesses.
Exactly. And that's why understanding SEW, like really getting it and being able to see those potential pitfalls, it's crucial, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, where, let's be honest, the business environment, it can be unpredictable.
So it's not enough to just be aware of those like emotional undercurrents.
Yeah.
You have to know how to navigate them.
You got it. And that brings us to the final dimension of SEW, renewal through succession. Because this is often where things get really interesting, even in the best of families.
Because it's not just about passing the baton. It's about making sure that next generation, they're ready, right? They have the skills, the business acumen, but also those deeply ingrained SEW values.
And in Latin America and the Caribbean, you've got this larger pool of potential heirs, right? Those extended family structures we talked about. So the stakes are even higher.
Because now you've got multiple branches of the family tree, each one, maybe, with their own ideas about who should be in charge, what direction the business should take.
And don't forget the pressure of operating in, a constantly changing environment. You need a successor who understands the family legacy, but they've also got to be able to make tough decisions, adapt, innovate. It's a lot to ask.
Finding that sweet spot between honoring the past and at the same time embracing the future.
Exactly. It's not about just, picking the oldest son or the favorite daughter. It's about finding the person who embodies the family's SEW, the one who can guide them through the good times and the bad. High stakes, for sure.
And this is where, I imagine, that idea of mixed gamble comes in.
Mm.
They're not just clinging to the old ways, right? These businesses, they're making calculated decisions, trying to find that balance between their SEW and, well, the reality of a changing world.
Absolutely. It's this fascinating paradox. You see this reverence for tradition, those SEW values, but also this awareness that the world is changing. You snooze, you lose.
So how do they reconcile those two things? Tradition and, the need to adapt.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's about recognizing that sometimes preserving SEW, it means taking risks, embracing new ideas, maybe even challenging those long-held assumptions. It's about being SEW sensitive.
Okay, so let's unpack this SEW sensitive idea a little bit.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like a pretty important concept.
It's crucial. Think of it as this constant process of assessing, adapting. These businesses are always asking, how do our SEW priorities, how do they affect our risk tolerance? Are there traditions holding us back? How can we leverage our SEW to our advantage? It's dynamic.
So not just a one-time thing, but an ongoing process, always evolving.
Exactly. Like they're doing this intricate dance, adjusting their steps to stay in sync with the music, but never losing sight of, the core choreography.
Delicate balance. But it
Yeah.
sounds like that ability to find that sweet spot, tradition and transformation, well, that's what's allowed so many of these family businesses to not just survive, but to really thrive over generations.
It's remarkable, isn't it? And it makes you realize Latin America and the Caribbean, it's so diverse.
Right. So while this research gives us a framework, it's not like a one-size-fits-all situation.
Not at all. Every country, every region, it's got its own personality, its own way of doing things. What works in Chile might not work in Colombia, and vice versa.
So how do we account for that diversity, those differences, and still use this idea of SEW to understand how these businesses operate?
That's the exciting part. We gotta zoom in, get into the weeds, because that's where those real aha moments are hiding.
So we're taking this SEW framework, this magnifying glass, and focusing it on, say, family businesses in Peru's tech scene, or, I don't know, the wine industry in Argentina, seeing how it plays out on the ground.
Exactly. A young entrepreneur in Lima, they're gonna have a different perspective than a fifth generation winemaker, right? Their SEW, it's gonna look different.
Totally.
Yeah.
And yet, they're both operating within this broader context, this Latin American, Caribbean family business world, navigating those same VUCA waters just in their own way.
Yeah.
Which, brings us back to our listener and that final thought you wanted to leave them with.
Yes. Because, we've covered a lot of ground, but really we're just scratching the surface here. So the question is, how does this research, this SEW stuff, how does it connect with your experiences in the Latin American Caribbean business world? I mean, that's what it's all about, right?
Like, we've given our listeners a key, and now it's up to them to, see what locks it unlocks in their own professional lives.
There you go. Maybe you're looking to invest in a family business, or you're a consultant helping with succession planning. Understanding those SEW nuances, man, that can make or break the deal.
Because reading about family influence, that's one thing. But actually
Yeah.
seeing it play out, like when a third-generation CEO is trying to modernize their grandfather's business, that's a whole other level.
Totally. That's where the real learning happens, when you connect these ideas, these theories, to your own experiences, those aha moments. You start seeing them everywhere.
So it's more than just understanding SEW. It's like internalizing it, becoming fluent in this whole other language of business.
Right. And realizing that in Latin America, the Caribbean, those numbers, the balance sheets, they're only part of the story. There's always a family, a history behind the scenes, emotions, relationships. It's all connected.
It's business, but personal.
And that's what makes it so interesting.
Couldn't agree more. This has been great. Really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. And to everyone listening, keep exploring this stuff. There's a whole world of CW out there waiting to be discovered.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, everyone.